Around the year 1800, the world started moving faster. Okay, that's an oversimplification, but let me explain. Modern humans have been around for about 300,000 years. For about 98% of that time, the fastest that anyone could travel was however fast they could run. And then around 6,000 years ago, we realized that we could climb on the back of horses, and they could make us go faster. And then, for 6,000 years, until around the year 1800, the fastest that anyone went on land, whether it was an ancient Egyptian or Thomas Jefferson, was on the back of a horse. And then, in the span of just 100 years, everything started going faster. Suddenly, you could speed into New York City on a steam engine. You could communicate with other continents via telegraph wires. You could brighten your home with artificial light and pop around the city on cable cars. Technology literally changed the world in the blink of an eye. I mean, you could have been born before electricity and lived to see humans walking on the moon. So all of this new technology was liberating, and there was no better place to experience the futuristic life quite like the Big Apple. But all this technology also took up space. And as we built skyscrapers, elevated trains, telegraph poles with webs of tangled and dangling wires, it made an already cramped New York City even more claustrophobic. Everywhere you looked, there was just like tall stuff. But the stuff was making our lives easier and better, so we kept building. More trains, more telegraph poles, more streetcars and cable cars and wires. Nothing could go wrong, right? Right? Well, that's exactly how life felt on the morning of March 11th, 1888. The sun was shining and it was shaping up to be another warm day in New York City. Reading the morning paper over a cup of coffee, you'd see that the forecast called for, at worst, a fresh brisk wind and some rain. Winter was over and things were starting to look up. But just off the coast, something was brewing. The unseasonably warm air was colliding with an Arctic front, swirling into a frenzy as it barreled towards New York City. What happened next would be the most devastating disaster that the city had ever seen. More than 400 lives lost. Buildings buried up to the 5th story in snow. New York City would quite literally disappear overnight. In its wake, New York wouldn't just rebuild, it would transform into a more modern, more progressive city. A city where women would rise to the forefront of science and culture. So thank you to my subscribers for always tuning in, and if you are new here and you're intrigued, hit subscribe down below and join me as we get swept up in the Great White Hurricane of 1888, this time on Painting the Past. So before I get started with the painting, I have a question to ask. I'm really grateful for all of the people who have started to tune into this channel, and I found that most of the people who watch seem to care a lot about the history, which is great. I continue to paint, but I'm kind of wondering, do you like the paintings or would you like to see something different with the paintings? I thought this channel would be more about art than history, but it started to kind of go the opposite direction. So just drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts on if you enjoy having the painting running while I'm talking. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts. So as we get started, I want to share my thought and rationale behind this composition. I was recently at the Met in New York City, and I was looking at some old Renaissance pieces. And one of the most inspirational things that Renaissance painters did is they used a ton of symbolism. So they would add very out-of-place objects in an otherwise realistic scene in order to tell a story. And I'd like to try doing that with this composition. So I want to show the city after the storm, like the morning after, with hazy sunlight, a streetcar buried in snow, maybe a telegraph pole that's toppled over, but then the symbolism. At that time, the people that dug the city out of the snow would have been primarily men. I'd like to have 2 women as the focus of this piece, surveying the damage and holding shovels to show, through symbolism, that it was really a lot of these women that helped bring New York out of the storm and out of this old era and into a more modern era. So that's the idea behind this composition. And to get started, I'm just going to give it a nice wash of cool blue and some really warm yellow to get that sun. And then I'm going to focus on the main pieces here, which are the streetcar and the 2 women. So I'm going to block in those shapes. The bridge, which is the Brooklyn Bridge, I'd like in the background. So I'm going to use very little paint and a lot of water to keep it nice and distant and really light in value. So the Great White Hurricane wasn't actually the first major blizzard to hit New York. It was the sixth recorded instance. In 1871, another major blizzard, known as the Great Storm, wreaked havoc on the city. And by then, telegraph poles and wires crisscrossed New York, forming a dense web of communication lines. But when the storm tore them down, it briefly cut the city off from the rest of the world. Yet despite this disruption, no one seriously considered moving the cables underground. Instead, they simply built more telegraph poles. Later that decade, New York introduced an elevated train system, followed by a cable car system that pulls streetcars using cables laid in tracks. In 1878, the Bell Company installed the city's first telephone pole, and rather than using existing telegraph poles, they just stuck more poles in alongside them, because as history often shows, humans tend to act first and think later. So by the 1880s, New York's skyline was tangled with thousands of overhead telegraph and telephone wires stretching above its bustling streets. Despite its reputation as a modern metropolis, the city lagged behind London and Paris, which were already experimenting with burying wires underground. So by the time the Great White Hurricane struck in 1888, London had been using an underground train system for 20 years. And side note, London's subway at this time was just a tiny tunnel that ran steam engines, like coal, fire, and steam, all running underground in these little tunnels. It's kind of a miracle that any of us are alive today. So New York wasn't just developing an infrastructure at this time. Socially, it was a hub of progressive ideas. It was a place where free thinking and expanding opportunities reigned. This was especially significant for women, who had long been confined to traditional domestic roles in the household. In fact, New York had been the heart and soul of the suffrage movement, advocating for women's rights to vote. 20 years before the Great White Hurricane, Susan B. Anthony formed the American Equal Rights Association, where men and women of all races would meet at a church in Union Square to show support for women's suffrage. They would introduce a bill that included the women's right to vote 10 years before the blizzard, but it would take almost 30 years for that bill to become a law. But even without the right to vote, women were integrating deeper into the fabric of New York City at this time. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell became the first woman to earn a medical degree in America, and in 1857 she opened a hospital that exclusively treated women and children, many of whom were immigrants. I actually went to the site of that hospital recently, and today it's a UPS store. There's not even a plaque, and somehow I'm not surprised. Also thriving in New York at this time was a young woman named Nellie Bly, who I will absolutely do an entire episode on in the future. In 1886, when she was 21, she traveled to Mexico, where she was working as an investigative journalist, and there she exposed the harsh conditions of Mexico's dictatorship. She ended up having to flee the country when she was charged with exposing government secrets. 1 year later, and just 1 year before the Great White Hurricane of 1888, she faked insanity to be admitted into an asylum on Roosevelt Island in New York, where she experienced and then exposed and wrote about the horrific treatment of its patients. After reading Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, she decided to travel around the world by herself in 72 days. And when she was 31, she married a 73-year-old millionaire who, not surprisingly, died shortly after, and then she ran the company that he started. Later in life, she covered the Eastern Front during World War I, and she was the first woman to travel to the war zone between Serbia and Austria, where she was mistakenly arrested for being a British spy. So Nellie Bly was a trailblazer, one of many women who dared to challenge institutions long controlled by men. In the 1880s, New York was really the only place in America where such defiance was even possible. So despite New York's mature social foundation, on the eve of the storm, its physical infrastructure was basically a house of cards waiting for a gust of wind. But what made this storm so intense wasn't just the sheer magnitude of it. It was the fact that nobody prepared for it. The U.S. Weather Service, then under the Army Signal Corps, had failed to predict the storm, forecasting only light rain for March 12th. When people woke up on the morning of the 12th, they were shocked to find the city buried in snow. But New Yorkers are tough, and many of them went about their day as usual. After all, there was no official signal that the storm would get worse. Around 9 a.m., as the storm intensified, the disasters started. New York's elevated trains, which sat 20 to 30 feet above ground, were full of passengers, no doubt panicking as they stalled and skidded around on their icy tracks, colliding into each other like bumper cars. Around 15,000 people were stuck on these elevated trains. Some New Yorkers, in true hustler fashion, cobbled together ladders and then charged the people that were stuck in the train cars to climb down. So people quickly realized that all the towering structures that had cropped up around the city over the past decade stood no chance against the elements. Telegraph poles and brand new telephone poles collapsed under the weight of snow and ice, which ultimately caused mass communication blackouts for days. So without the ability to communicate with the outside world, the New York Stock Exchange shut down completely. Desperate to keep the exchange running, they tried to relay communications by routing telegraphs across the transatlantic cables to England and then back to other American cities. But this was slow and very expensive. One cable cost about $7,000 in today's money. Cable cars, the flashy new technology that enabled New Yorkers to zip around the city, derailed and lost control in wild fashion, colliding into pedestrians and street lamps. Everything was dark. As the New York Herald wrote the following day, all the electric lamps were out and no attempt to light the gas lamps was made. A ghastly procession of wounded men and women began to file into the wards of the hospitals. But even more impactful was the dreadful cold that the blizzard brought with it. So even if you were safe indoors, most of the city at this time was heated by coal, which was shipped in by train and barge. So in the blizzard, these shipments were cut off, casting the city into cold darkness. With demand surging and supply entirely cut off, people with private stockpiles began to price gouge, charging desperate New Yorkers exorbitant prices for coal. One grocer on 8th Street raised the price of a pail of coal from 10 cents to $1, but the public didn't take kindly to this. That grocer woke up the next day to the wheels of his wagon stolen, along with a message in chalk that read, "Fair exchange is no robbery." And anyone who tried to buy hand sanitizer at the start of the pandemic will tell you that the world changes, but people kind of stay the same. So maybe the worst part about all of this was that the streets themselves became full of sewage. So at this time, New York had about 200 miles of road, and shockingly, there was no official department of sanitization or hired city workers who coordinated to clean the hundreds of tons of horse manure and waste generated by New Yorkers. Instead, different neighborhoods would hire small independent contractors who would work on their own schedules. Waste removal was mainly done with a shovel and a horse-drawn cart, one of the few relics of the old way of life in the big city. So there was no official garbage collection. Trash was literally just thrown into the street. And at this time, the city lacked a modern sewer system. Many buildings used cesspools and outhouses, which often overflowed in bad weather. So the blizzard would freeze waste in place. But then when the thaw came, sewage and melted snow mixed, running through the streets. So people wading through the post-blizzard slush would risk infection because diseases like typhoid, cholera, and tuberculosis were already common in the city. So city streets were covered in shattered glass, 500,000 pounds of manure, and 60,000 gallons of horse urine that was frozen into the snow. Not only that, but at this time, New York had no organized snow removal system. People either shoveled it themselves or let it melt, which is, by the way, the choice that my wife gives me every time it snows here. So in the end, 24 million cubic yards of snow had to be removed by hand due to the lack of snowplows. This storm became the catalyst for forming the Department of Sanitation, and to this very day, that department handles both garbage and snow removal. So as the storm died down, the damage began to emerge. The blizzard had caused around 400 deaths along the Northeast, with 200 of those coming from New York City and another 100 being sailors who perished in the waters just beyond New York's coastline. Among those dead was former U.S. Senator Roscoe Conkling. So during the blizzard, Conkling left his Wall Street office to walk to his home on 25th and Madison. But by the time he reached Union Square, the snow was waist deep. So Conkling described nearly giving up and sinking down to die, saying, "There was no light. I pulled the ice and snow from my eyes and held my hand up there till everything was melted off. But it was too dark. I came as near giving right up and sinking down there to die as a man can." So although he made it home, he contracted pneumonia from the trek and he died shortly after. So Conkling was an old-school establishment politician, a relic of the Gilded Age in a time when rich and powerful men ruled New York. His death, much like the storm, swept in the end of an era. The old ways and New York's old infrastructure had proven fragile, and it was clear that the city needed to modernize. For one, this blizzard served as a turning point about whether the city should move trains underground. Looking to cities like London and Boston, they made their decision to tear down the old elevated trains and build an underground network. Also, as a result of the blizzard, New Yorkers realized that they didn't have any central leadership to turn to in a disaster. After all, almost everything in the city was privatized, from telegraph wires to transit systems to the sanitation teams. So the storm forced New Yorkers to rethink what role their government should play, with many New Yorkers calling for the mayor's office to assume a larger and more proactive role in day-to-day management of the city. In many ways, the modern concept of a mayor was born out of this storm. Following the blizzard, a woman named Cynthia Leonard became the first woman to run for political office, hoping to become mayor and promising sweeping reforms to the city. Ultimately, she didn't win, but this was just one of a number of cultural and structural changes that started to appear after the blizzard. The blizzard showed how the poor suffered the most, trapped in overcrowded tenements without heat, sanitation, or medical care. A few years later, Lillian Wald founded the Henry Street Settlement, which pioneered public health and nursing, helping New York's most vulnerable communities. Her work in hygiene, disease prevention, and social services was exactly the kind of modernization that New York City needed post-blizzard. Not just new buildings and better transit, but a healthier, more equitable city. The blizzard also exposed how quickly workers could be stranded, frozen, or left to fend for themselves, especially women working in factories and textile mills. So in the following decade, labor activism exploded in New York, led by women like Clara Lemlich, who fought for better wages, fair working hours, and safer conditions. The uprising of the 20,000, a massive garment workers' strike, was a part of a larger movement to modernize labor laws, a necessity in a city that had seen how fragile life could be in a disaster. So after the Great White Hurricane of 1888, New York wasn't just rebuilt, it was reimagined. The storm wiped away remnants of the old aristocracy, making space for a more modern and free city. It forced innovation, from underground transit to new ways of living and working, shaping the New York that we know today. In all my research on nerdy history topics, the one fact I've come to know for certain is that history repeats itself. And as I read about the Great White Hurricane, I kept thinking about the pandemic, which swept through our world and left lasting change in its wake. It reshaped how we work, how we connect. It accelerated transformations that might have taken decades. Out of disaster comes reinvention, and just as New Yorkers dug themselves out of their storm and reshaped their city, it's on us to redefine the world that we have inherited. And with that, let's talk about how I probably could have redefined this painting, although I'm not too upset with it. I really like the lighting. By the way, it's so small. It was really fun to do a tiny painting. I'm happy with the light. I love the glow. It feels like the storm has just passed and the air is just settling. Obviously, the subject I'm really happy with. I do think that the composition is messy. You know, when I first finished this painting, I left this studio here and I went back to my house and I sat down and I told my wife, I think I want to give up, because I was so frustrated. I spent so much time on this painting and I feel like it didn't come out right. But she reminded me that there's no such thing as a bad painting, just a good lesson. And I really like that tip. Overall, I'm still quite happy with it. I love the technique around the lighting. I think the bridge turned out okay. Probably made it too busy with the telegraph pole, but I think the subject is a good one and it's a good lesson. People are challenging, but I kind of got them here. So not too upset with it overall. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and as always, please hit subscribe if you enjoyed this. It helps me continue to make these videos, and I will see you next time on Painting the Past.